Thank you, Josh, and thank you for praying that we have a mindset to be happy, because that is a choice that we make. It's not based on our circumstances. It's based on our hope. It's based on our confidence and trust in God. And it's a conscious decision to walk by our faith and not our sight. We've been studying in, I know the name of this book, Building Up One Another. I just call it One Another in my head. We're studying one another because all the lessons are seem to incorporate that phrase in the title. I think we're about lesson 2-ish. You know my whole thing about not being so concerned about frameworks around classes. I just kind of let it wander. We have been discussing some of the material in lesson 2, pages 10 and 11. From my perspective, we covered what I thought was the core material I wanted to get over, dealing with humility as being a fundamental feature of this analogy of the body being a model for the church. Humility is discussed in some detail in Romans 12 and Ephesians 4 and Philippians 2 and 1 Corinthians 12. All of those contexts are in relation to the church as a body. All of those. I think maybe Philippians is not maybe the word body, but the context is the same. Being of the same mind, being of the same spirit, and having all humility and submissiveness one to another. The lesson outline goes into this discussion a little bit of the idea of, well, what happens when the honeymoon is over? And there's the comparison to a marriage relationship or any relationship where there's the discovery and the excitement of learning new people, and what happens when that wears off. I don't know, maybe the Walker household's different, but with our 4 kids, there was never a moment where there wasn't new discovery in our house. It seems like we always found ways to enjoy one another, and things were evolving, things changing, and there was always something to learn about each other. Having that interest in that enjoyment in one another's company, I don't think we get bored with each other. And do you need to restore the excitement in your relationship with the church? And how might one do that? We can make this a thought question. I think I'm sort of getting to a question eventually here. Is that a problem for you? Is that a problem for us as a church? And what do we do to try to address that? You might think about that a little bit this morning. But I think there are some hints as to things that we do that encourage us not to take that mindset, not to get too comfortable. Is that the right word? Too used to one another, or taking one another for granted in our relationships. How does that play into our love and devotion to one another? We can do things for one another out of submissiveness without liking each other, without having any affection toward one another in a more personal way, but it sort of takes the joy out of it, doesn't it? What do we do about the family and keeping our interest in one another? Or is that covered? Are we okay there? There's a hand up here.
So I was thinking about one of the paragraphs that Wilson wrote about endeavor to keep the honeymoon alive. Mm-hmm. So different from what I thought, that once the honeymoon was over, it was over. So a continual attempt to not throw that away, keep working toward that in our marriages and in the church, that there will be other things that enter in, but it's not the absolute, doesn't have to be the absolute end to honeymoon-ishness.
Now we're making up new words. Honeymooning-ish, meaning an atmosphere of discovery and interest in one another. I think those things are useful. I think some people that comes more natural than others. I think in some relationships within the church that comes more natural than others. And even sitting in this room right now, there are some who are more difficult to have a closer personal bond to than others. Some of us keep the walls up more than others. Some of us are very open with everything in our lives, and some of us tend to keep things more close to ourselves. And that could be personality types, that can be part of who we are. It can also, however, be signals that someone is more distant from God and therefore less close to us. So there are reasons to have those feelings toward one another, because it's a way to take the temperature of the group and to really know that people are moving forward in their spiritual walk with Christ. We can fake it, but it takes a lot of work to keep it up year after year after year. If you're insincere, I think eventually you're going to let your guard down, and people are going to see that. And so if we are connected with one another, I think that's important towards our responsibilities to submit to one another, to know each other. But it's also, canary in the coal mine is the phrase I think some use. There's a warning signal there that may be subtle. That's an old reference. I don't think there are too many coal miners in here. But the old reference was, as the oxygen levels dropped, the canary was less tolerant of low O2 than humans. So if your canary drops over dead and everyone's working hard in the mines, you probably got a problem with circulation in the mine, and you need to deal with that. Or methane gas or whatever it was. There were toxins in the mine that the canary responded to before others noticed, before human beings noticed. So evidently they took canaries down to the coal mines with them as this warning signal before they got O2 sensors and all the equipment that they developed later. But that's the idea of looking for those warning signals. And I think how we interact with one another with an interest for one another, and with a genuine sincerity of affection for one another, is definitely something to be monitored and be concerned about. There's one issue, or not issue, there's one aspect of this language of the body. I'm sorry. We have comment. Yes, ma'am.
I think it goes back keeping the honeymoon alive and like staying in that newlywed phase. I think it goes back to the selflessness that we talked about in the first chapter, because like, I mean, we're newly married still. It's under 2 years. Like, I don't know how long the newlywed phase lasts.
Well, isn't it kind of up to you? Isn't that the
guess.
point? Right? So how's it going, Josh? Tell us. No, never mind. Go ahead.
But we're still like discovering things that we didn't know about each other. And I think that's something that goes to the selflessness, is that if we were both like acting selfish, we wouldn't learn about each other because we would be so focused on ourselves. And I think that's what we as a church have to do, is not focus on ourselves, and then we start learning little bits and pieces about people that we had no idea about before.
I completely agree. Great observation. Taylor.
So I kind of have a good example of this. Couple years ago, 2 years ago, I believe it was, Jeff asked me to help Joy teach class. So when you talk about keeping the honeymoon alive in the church, something different for me that I've never done before, I never really considered doing it before, and that was maybe some untapped hidden talent that I enjoyed it and kept me going. So I think maybe being involved in different ways that we haven't thought of before, that's definitely a good way to keep us in our honeymoon alive in the church.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll talk more about that in the next lesson, actually, too, about this idea of devotion and what that means to making sure we're all tied in, we're all tapped in, and keeping busy with God's work is an excellent way to do that. It's an excellent way to do that. Anything else on this discussion? Like I said, we'll go a little deeper into this still. This is only lesson 2, and we'll keep going deeper into some of these themes as we go on. So good ideas. There was just a thought of mine as I was kind of preparing for this lesson, and I want to look at it just briefly. Romans 11. I just think it's kind of an interesting use of the idea of the body, and here it's kind of a discussion in verses maybe 18 and 19, if I can read my notes, of sort of the natural body and how those who were born into Judaism may have had a different concept of what that looked like than did those who were what this text refers to as being grafted in. And so in 18 and 19 verse of Romans 11, don't be arrogant toward the branches, but if you are arrogant, remember that remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Well, who would say that in this context? Who would say branches were broken off to make room for me? The Gentiles could have had that attitude. Verse 20 says, quite right, they were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Don't be conceited, but fear. There's this, the body, that this analogy we've used also suggests that it's kind of like Frankenstein's monster, in that it is put together of separate parts of the body to make a whole. And like Dr. Frankenstein, he carved off things that weren't working and put in replacement parts. And so there's a bit there of it being sort of cobbled together. And then in the various stories and movie accounts and maybe the original book of Frankenstein's monster, there's this idea that all of these parts function together. They had been made alive by being basically grafted into the living body that was this, creation, this monster. There's a sense in which we become grafted in. We may not be having the issue in our culture of Jew and Gentile, but I think there is still this mentality or this still observation that sometimes what's being grafted in is that we have individuals who devote themselves to God and don't have the same background that we have and don't have the same family raising that we had. And many of us who were raised in the church, I think in particular, can get our minds in the place where we're kind of the original body. And then here are these parts that are grafted in. The whole purpose of this conversation is to recognize that what? It's not the branches that are feeding the root, it's the roots that's taking care of the branches. So having been grafted in makes you just as much a part of the body as one who might consider themselves more of a natural part of the body and not being a later addition, so to speak. That there's enough room in the church, we don't have to cut anyone out to make room for more. But to the point of there was a separation by God from the Hebrew nation because of their unbelief. That did open opportunity, but God didn't have to remove living, active branches in order to do that. But don't get the idea too, again, culturally, we experience some of that, where people aren't by nature like ourselves, but here we are, cobbled together by the blood of Christ, fashioned together, if you don't like the word cobbled together, fashioned together by the blood of Christ to be one active body.
Well, I'm going to try to put this in historical perspective in that at this time, I don't know how many local groups there were in Rome or local groups there were in Corinth. I mean, it appears that there was just basically one. But nowadays, I mean, we've got the ability, the mobility to people say, well, I'm going to move to this metropolitan area. I'm going to, try out different churches, see which one fits me or which one I can fit into better. And, versus fitting into any local group or fitting into this group. And say, so the honeymoon would be, to me, would be new members coming in, new members coming in, and if you've got that constant new blood coming in, then that honeymoon can be ongoing and ongoing. But if you've got a stagnant group, then we have to work awfully extra hard at it and not have to, to keep that honeymoon alive with all of us. But I just, historically, they didn't travel and, Sunday morning they get up and say, well, I'm going to go to this group today. And the next Sunday I'm going to go to a different group and see where I'm going to go to, and pick and choose whichever one's going to be, I think is going to work out for me and my family. They had to make it work. And I think we need to have that same attitude. Regardless of who is here or who is in this group, we need to make it work. And I like the one thing it says when it comes, say all body members must work hard at creating and keeping unity. So it's not an organic thing. Once again, that unity we don't always just have like-minded people. That's how we assemble a congregation, is having all like-minded people. Let's go off and start a new work, but let's make sure we're all of the same mind. No, we've got to work hard at, regardless of who's in that congregation, at unity.
This next lesson brings the idea of the family in together a little bit more, and there I think we'll have more conversation about what like-mindedness means when we actually also disagree with one another. And I think that to Dan's point, there's ways you work at that, but it's not by ignoring the fact that sometimes we just don't see things the same way. And so we have to learn there's got to be ways to deal with those situations. Anything else? Discussion, questions? Any of these pique your interest? Any discussion? Tell me which one you want to talk about. Still a little bit on the introductory side, but we'll go as deep or as brief as you want with these. I told you when we started, you've got to pick out the discussion questions you want to discuss. And if you don't want to discuss them, we can move on. Andrew.
I guess I was looking at question 3 where it talks about the habit of being critical and criticizing even behind a person's back, and just ways to avoid that, ways to rethink that habit. And I had written that, maybe trying to see if the opinions or the things that we're stating, can we also modify those to say, are we heightening a person? Are we raising up a person? Or is this lowering a person? Is my assessment of how someone did and what they said, is it an uplifting thing or is it a lowering thing? Because I think if we tried to define it in terms of, is it one or the other, it becomes a lot easier to see which is criticism and which is praise or saying something good about the person. And then I was also thinking about just the nature of forgiving when there's a complaint. I don't remember which of these passages it was. I think it was the one in Colossians that talked about forgiving or overlooking complaints. I want to see which one that was. I think it was Colossians 3.
Verse 13. All right.
Yes. If one has complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you. And something we talked about together was, is that forgiving of complaint face to face to the person? And I think the answer is yes, if perhaps the complaint is of a serious nature or if it's of a very direct nature known between the two of you. I think there's room too for, when I see forgiving a complaint, I think that action can be contained entirely within yourself. If it's a thought that originated in your head, you haven't expressed it to them necessarily, it's possible to just say, you know what, I'm going to forgive this person of the complaint that I've generated and let this die in my own mind because it doesn't need to go anywhere else beyond the walls of my skull.
Agreement with that statement or disagreement? Support? Kind of a grunt of approval over here, maybe? Grace wants to have something to say.
No, I I agree with Andrew. I don't think every negative thought or feeling or disagreement or complaint we have against a person needs to be expressed. I mean, a lot of times things that we think are better off just being thought and then squashed where they began, as opposed to said. And again, I think the point Andrew made is good. I don't know if he was explicit about it or just alluded to it, but the idea of are we helping or hurting the person? I mean, if we're trying to build them up and make them stronger, criticism's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
But when all you do is ever be critical, then that's a problem. I mean, that's, for one, it's a mindset issue. And what you say may be true, but it's not very helpful because it comes across from a person who's always complaining and never never really encouraging. And that's not helpful. It's not helpful to you for sure. And it's not really, it can generally be a negative thing for other people too. They don't care to listen because you're always a Debbie Downer. Criticism's not bad. It just needs to be couched with a recognition of things that are good too. Managers, I think, dread hearing, oh, a customer wants to speak with you, because typically, what do managers hear? They hear complaints. They don't usually hear good things. And so I have complained to managers about poor service or poor treatment by employees, but I try to make a habit of also going to managers and telling them when an employee does a really good job, you need to hold on to this person and keep them as long as you can, because they're really good at what they do and they make you look good. So, I mean, I think we earn the right to help someone with critical statements when we're also a person who is willing to recognize the good in something. And I think this was the one that stood out to me too, because I think there are people who immediately get in their car and the first thing they want to do is badmouth everything that happened that morning. They've got all the criticisms for everything that happened. And the problem is that too often some people are looking for the bad, and you'll find it. I mean, people make mistakes. People say things that are not exactly the way you would say it because they're not you. And, was it wrong? Was it just less than stellar? Those are questions we need to ask. And what we ought to be looking for is the good. Love believes all things. And so it's looking for the good aspects of what happens in worship. And if we're not doing that, then we need to work on our attitude, more so than trying to work on everybody else to just be what we want them to be. I mean, problem's probably not with them. Don used to say to Benjamin when he would have problems with people, there's a common denominator. If you always have problems with other people, it's probably not them. It may have something to do with you and your attitude. And the truth is that's sometimes true of us. If we frequently have problems with other people, maybe the common denominator is not that everybody else is so messed up. It's that I'm not being who I ought to be. Maybe I'm the problem.
We've had comments about the sort of the compliment sandwich. I think came from some of our customer service oriented people in the room earlier. You know, you find ways to say that, but I think the initial thought I had was the word forbearance again. To bear up under other people's shortcoming, whatever that is, if that's physical, if that's spiritual. And if we're never commanded to be forbearing, that means all of us are perfectly fine the way we are. And that's not true. So there has to be both a measure of when is criticism used in a positive, complimentary manner, and when do we just say, as especially those who've been married for about 2 years or less, I'm just not going to say that out loud, am I? Because I value the peace and tranquility, and if it's something that is inconsequential, let it remain inconsequential. I think a lot of times as elders, when you hear of these two are going at each other, it usually ended up starting with something that just should have been not said in many cases. There may be some substance there to why there are problems, but the little piece of flint and the little spark that started the fire weren't really the issue anyway. That little flint and that little spark was something that probably should have been left alone and overlooked. And then without the heat of the emotion, you could then work on the core substantive issues that exist. But once you get that fire blazing and going, logic goes out the window, reasonable conversation goes out the window, and we have problems. Mark.
Back to Andrew's statement, I think is so true that a lot of things that you have in your mind need to stay there. But one of the things I've found is if there's something that I really feel is a problem, say with somebody, if I stop and I think of two really honest positives about that person, things that are good, but they have to be honest and they have to be true, then the thing that I thought was a problem sometimes fades into the background and remains unsaid, just as you have said. But the same thing also applies when you feel that you do need to address a problem. If you can start out, like you say, with those two honest positives, but they have to be true, they have to be honest. And then it seems that criticism is more accepted when a person realizes that you aren't just criticizing, that you see good things in them, but for you, this is a problem. And I've really found that true, as you said, when managers have to address their employees with something that is truly a problem, if you can start out. And the same thing applies when you need to address someone about church doctrine and truths in the church. When you can start with an agreement, you're more likely to reach them. And so that feeling in your mind even of positiveness really helps.
Drew again. Jeff? Oh, he's going around the other way.
I think Margaret's point is excellent in that there does need to be this conscious effort to really delay unnecessary harm and slow down whatever it is you were going to say that could cause that unnecessary harm. And I feel like it comes full circle back to talking about what the honeymoon phase means. And I didn't make this comment when we were talking about it then, but I didn't like that term used here because, and maybe I'm going to be labeled as completely unromantic in saying this, I feel like the honeymoon phase is not the phase you want to stay in. The goal is not to prolong the honeymoon phase, it's to get to a working together phase. And in the honeymoon phase, there is a stress on being overly agreeable and agreeableness. And those Chuck said winning over. You were still working at winning over that person, and
It sounds more like dating than it does the honeymoon, because I mean, once they say I do, haven't you won them over?
and am I trying to say that, oh, you stop being agreeable? No, but I hope people get my point, which is there is a I got to be really careful. Agreeableness doesn't end, but I think what we're calling the honeymoon phase, sometimes that agreeableness is being motivated by, well, I'm going to be agreeable with this person because I like when they're nice to me, and I want them to keep being nice to me. There's almost a selfishness, I think, that goes along with that. And in the working together phase, that's when you really are able to kind of set aside that, well, I just want them to be good to me, and ask yourself, am I really wanting the good of this person for the sake of being good to this person alone, with no thought of repayment or this for that kind of mentality. It's really setting aside that interest in self in the interest of working together. And so with what Margaret was saying, that criteria of, well, when do I need to say this thing that's bothering me? When do I need to speak this criticism, or just, shut up and keep it in myself and don't say anything, and everyone in the church should just not say anything and keep everything to yourself? Mm-hmm. It's not a dictatorship of you're never allowed to speak your mind. I think one of the criteria for when to speak up is this a barrier to working together? Is this a barrier to both of our work being done as Christians? And so if the complaint is something that this is hindering me working as a Christian, this is hindering you working as a Christian, then something probably ought to be said. And like you were saying, if it starts with just a slight or a comment or something that shouldn't be a barrier, but it's unaddressed and it builds and then it becomes a huge fight, now it is preventing working together. So now it gets addressed. And that's usually when things end up coming to light or being spoken about. So I don't know what I was trying to say when I started all this. I guess it was, working together ought to be the priority of what our criticisms are aimed at.
So Walker men overthink things, and Andrew's guilty. But I see what he's trying to say. When is it that we're being love expressing love out of an altruistic, non-selfish reason? And when are we expressing love due to the fact of reciprocity or repercussions? I like big words. Reciprocity is the idea of payback or a mutual agreement that you're nice to me, I'm nice to you, that's the way it's going to be. Repercussions is I don't want to cause trouble. Trouble. What is trouble? Is it troubling when we cannot communicate as a family of God? That's a yes. That's troubling. But are we also witness of troublemakers on occasion who seem to actually enjoy the conflict that arises when there's disagreement? And that's also a yes. There's one legislator in my mind, I don't have to say the name, and it's not who you're thinking of, but I've never known anyone who enjoys conflict as much as this person. He loves to argue. He loves it. He lives for it. He can be both a very effective legislator and one of the biggest pain in the tails you've ever seen at the same time, because you know that he is right in what he's saying, but you can't stand it that he's enjoying so much the fact that he's digging at someone else at the same time. And so you think I think he is his own worst enemy because he's right, but he's doing it to lift himself up and make himself look smarter and more important, and it just destroys his credibility. So people don't want to hear it. He's right, but no one wants to hear it. And so what's he doing? He's making his own misery. Or in his idea, it's his own enjoyment. It's his own recreation. It's to cause this kind of conflict. So this just got a lot more complex in lesson 2 than I expected it to, and that's good. In that, where is the balance between the things that ought to be kept to ourselves because they're not of substance that makes it difficult for us to work together, And as Margaret and Andrew and others are contributing to that conversation, I'm thinking, my kitchen. My kitchen is my kitchen. That's not Allison's kitchen. I have always called the kitchen my kitchen, and she knows that. I've always called it my kitchen, and when Allison prepares a dish and I come into the house or come into the room, what do? I lift the lid off the kettle and I taste it and I put seasoning in it to my taste. And Allison has got to where she doesn't say anything about that anymore. She knows I'm going to do it. And I don't do it to be aggravating. I do it because it's my kitchen. I see that as my kitchen. And we don't cook together. We cook independently but mutually. But we don't cook together. The girls will try to be in the kitchen the same time I am. And Allison says, I'm leaving the room. I'm leaving. There's too much sparks flying in here. So when is it that you're just not doing it the way I would do it? And when is it that you're going to cause a grease fire? Right? When is it that it's a matter of safety? And when is it a matter of this is just the way you want to do it? And how do you deal yourself with these thoughts? And how do you deal collectively with that? We've got all kinds of opinions. I started the class by saying I'm a very opinionated person, and I'm always right. But I don't have to always share my opinions on everything. Now, when it comes to cooking, I don't feel like that's a problem. I go ahead and share my opinions on that too. And I say to Rebecca, why don't you back off the lemon in this? And it would be better. Because she wants to over lemon everything she touches. Lemon's in 85% of her dishes, in case you didn't know that. She loves the tart. She loves the acidity. And that's her thing. And I'm going, I can't eat this. It's just too much lemon. So we go back and forth, back and forth. It's part of our dueling, I guess you'd say, as daughter and father. But we don't let it become a problem. She makes her food her way. I compliment her on her dishes when I'm enjoying them. I keep my mouth shut if I'm not. I just try to do it that way best I can. And sometimes I say, don't put so much lemon in it. But we've got to, again, keep a lot of things in mind as we communicate with one another, because communication is complex. It's on the surface level, it's the direct, it's the indirect, it's the passive aggression, it's the chance to be maybe an accommodating person who needs help, and you're just going to be quiet and let them get away with whatever they're doing that's harming themselves. Communication has so many layers that it's something that we learn from birth, and we have to keep working at it. But it's a big part of how are we going to be devoted to one another if we don't know how to communicate with one another. And so we got to use all these tools and such to get that done. Here's Chuck. Oh, I'm sorry, here.
First off, Rebecca's right. Lemon's delicious. So
I like lemon bars too, so.
no, Elizabeth, if I heard her right, Liz was saying she thought, why does the honeymoon have to end? And Andrew's saying
Why
we
would you
shouldn't
stay
be aiming
there?
for the honeymoon at all in the first
Yeah.
place. I think they're both saying the same thing. I don't think they're contradictory to each
I
other.
think so too.
Liz's point is not we should constantly live on vacation without any responsibilities. Her point is, why can't we keep those feelings alive? And I don't think Andrew intends to suggest that we aren't trying to do that. He's just recognizing that the honeymoon's not real. I mean, Ashley and I are getting ready to take a trip next week for our 10-year anniversary. We're far enough into our marriage to recognize it's going to be a wonderful trip, an opportunity for us to refresh and rejuvenate, but it's not real. I mean, we have children, we have jobs, we have responsibilities, and the honeymoon and trips like this take you away from most of that, at least the heavy lifting of those things. And so that aspect of things is not something we should aim for, because real life gets in the way. But just because real life gets in the way doesn't mean we can't still have those feelings. I mean, I have stronger feelings now for this church than I did in 2008 when I came. And to answer your question at the very beginning of class, yes, the Walker family is unique. And I think some people would look at it from the outside. Some would say it's not real. It's just a facade. So I'm just being honest. Some would say they just got lucky.
Mm-hmm.
They just, I mean, yeah, really. Those of us who know you well know that it's not luck and it's not a facade.
It's good fortune, though.
I don't believe that.
Oh,
I don't believe that
well,
for a minute.
It's a blessing.
It is a blessing,
And
but
I
I
tell
think it's a
people we've been blessed.
blessing that you all have worked at your whole life, and it's real, and people see that, and people are envious of it because there are aspects of it that everybody would like to have, but it takes work. And you all have not only, you and Allison have done the work in raising your children, and they have done the work in nurturing their relationships as siblings, and now in becoming the kind of adults that are good spouses and are going to be supportive. I'm not saying they're perfect, and nobody is, but you all have done the work, and that's the point of this chapter. If you want to keep the feelings of the honeymoon, that takes work. If you want to keep the feelings that you have for the church and develop those and nurture them, it takes work, and you've got to be willing to put forward the work in order to get the results that you're seeking after or that you want. And so we have to work at it. I mean, it takes effort. It takes me being invested, and I mean me being invested. Yeah, ultimately it takes all of us being invested, but the only person I can control is me. So I just have to look at, as Taylor said, ways that I can invest myself in the work so that I can grow in the ways that are going to be helpful for me, but also helpful for the church. And so it's about investing yourself in the work. And when all of us do that, when every part does its share, it causes the effective working of the body for the building up of itself in love, Ephesians 4:16. So that's what happens. That's the result. But it takes us each being willing to invest. And that's true in marriage. It's true in your job or career. It's true in the church. It's true in every aspect of life.
Yeah, the discussion in Romans 11 was, don't get the idea the church is lucky to have you. And that's true of our families too. Don't get the idea that they're just lucky they're related to you. And it is a universal responsibility. And we're going to try in lesson 3 to talk more about this universality of the responsibility of developing the one anotherness that we want in this group here. How it takes everybody doing it. This is not an elder's job. This is not a deacon's job. This is an everybody's job. Everybody. And we'll go into that in more detail. So we will pop over into lesson 3 for this coming Wednesday evening.